Maria Santos never imagined that answering a desperate babysitting ad would change 3 lives forever. The wealthy Hartwell family needed someone to handle their difficult 8-year-old son, Alexander, and Maria needed every dollar she could earn. What started as a temporary job became something much deeper when Maria saw past the boy's angry outbursts to the lonely child beneath. Years later, when Alexander returned as a successful young man and fell in love with Maria's daughter Sofia, he would prove that kindness planted in childhood can bloom into miracles. But when Maria faced her darkest hour, fighting for her life in a hospital bed, Alexander's words would echo through the corridors. "You saw me when no one else did, and now I see you." Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Maria Santos's small apartment, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and job listings torn from newspapers, her coffee growing cold as she calculated and recalculated numbers that never seemed to add up. At 32, Maria had been raising her daughter Sofia alone for 8 years, ever since her husband had walked out when Sofia was just a baby. The factory job she'd held for 5 years had ended abruptly when the company moved operations overseas, leaving Maria scrambling to find work that would pay enough to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. Sofia, now 8 years old with her mother's warm brown eyes and infectious smile, bounced into the kitchen wearing her school uniform, her backpack already slung over one shoulder. "Mama, you look worried again," Sofia said, her young voice carrying a wisdom that sometimes startled Maria. The little girl had grown up faster than she should have, learning to read her mother's moods and offer comfort when the weight of their circumstances pressed too heavily on Maria's shoulders. "Just thinking about work, mija," Maria replied, forcing a smile as she smoothed Sofia's dark hair. "Nothing for you to worry about. Are you ready for school?" She packed Sofia's lunch with the last of the bread and peanut butter, making a mental note to stretch their grocery budget even further this week. As she walked Sofia to the school bus stop, Maria's mind wandered to the babysitting ad she'd circled in red ink the night before. The Hartwell family was offering more money per hour than she'd ever earned, but something about the wording made her hesitate. They were looking for someone to handle their challenging son, someone with patience and understanding for difficult behaviors. After Sofia's bus disappeared around the corner, Maria returned to her apartment and stared at the phone number written in elegant script at the bottom of the ad. She'd been a mother for 8 years, she told herself. How difficult could one child be? With trembling fingers, she dialed the number, and within minutes found herself speaking to Mrs. Victoria Hartwell, whose crisp, professional tone immediately made Maria feel underdressed even over the phone. "Mrs. Santos, I'll be direct with you," Victoria said after a brief exchange of pleasantries. "Our son Alexander is, quite frankly, more than most people can handle. He's been through 7 babysitters in the past 6 months. He has behavioral issues that stem from, well, various circumstances. My husband and I travel frequently for business, and we need someone who won't quit at the first sign of trouble. The pay is generous because the work is demanding." Maria found herself agreeing to an interview that very afternoon, drawn by the promise of steady income and the challenge in Victoria's voice that seemed to dare her to succeed where others had failed. She spent the morning researching the Hartwell family online, discovering that Robert and Victoria Hartwell owned a chain of luxury hotels across the country. Their social media profiles showed them at charity galas and business conferences, always impeccably dressed and smiling for cameras, but Maria noticed that their son Alexander rarely appeared in any of the photos. The Hartwell estate sat behind iron gates in the most exclusive neighborhood Maria had ever seen, with manicured lawns that stretched like green carpets and houses that looked more like museums than homes. As she pressed the intercom button at the gate, Maria smoothed her best dress, a simple black number she'd worn to job interviews and parent-teacher conferences, hoping it would make the right impression. The gates swung open silently, and she drove her aging Honda up a circular driveway past fountains and perfectly trimmed hedges. Victoria Hartwell answered the door herself, a tall woman with platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun and wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Maria earned in a month. Her handshake was firm but brief, and her smile never quite reached her eyes as she led Maria through rooms filled with expensive furniture and artwork that looked too pristine to be lived in. "Alexander is in the playroom," Victoria explained as they walked through halls lined with family portraits that seemed to focus more on the house's architecture than its inhabitants. "I should warn you, he can be quite explosive when he doesn't get his way." The playroom was a stark contrast to the rest of the house, with toys scattered across the floor and crayon marks on the walls that had been hastily cleaned but not completely erased. In the center of the chaos sat a boy with dark hair and intelligent green eyes, methodically destroying a puzzle by throwing pieces across the room. When he saw his mother enter with a stranger, his face immediately contorted with anger, and he launched himself at a bookshelf, sweeping picture books onto the floor with deliberate violence. "Alexander, stop that immediately," Victoria commanded, but her voice carried a weary resignation that suggested this scene had played out countless times before. "This is Mrs. Santos. She might be your new babysitter if you can manage to behave yourself for 5 minutes." The boy turned his furious gaze on Maria, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't want another babysitter," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "They all leave anyway. Everyone always leaves." The raw pain in his words hit Maria like a physical blow, and she found herself stepping forward instead of backward, crouching down to Alexander's eye level despite Victoria's sharp intake of breath behind her. "You know what?" Maria said softly, ignoring the chaos around them and focusing entirely on the angry, hurt child in front of her. "You're absolutely right. People do leave sometimes, and that's really hard. But I'm not here to promise you I'll never leave. I'm here to promise you that while I'm here, I'll really see you. Not just the angry parts, but all of you." Alexander stared at her with suspicion, but his hands slowly unclenched, and Maria noticed the slight tremor in his lower lip that he was trying so hard to hide. Victoria cleared her throat behind them, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment, and began explaining the logistics of the job. Alexander would need supervision after school 3 days a week, and occasional evenings when she and her husband had business functions. The pay was indeed generous, more than Maria had dared hope for, and she accepted the position on the spot, even as Alexander retreated to a corner of the room and watched her with wary curiosity. That first week was a battle of wills that tested every ounce of patience Maria possessed. Alexander seemed determined to drive her away through sheer force of destruction and defiance. He threw food, refused to do homework, and had spectacular meltdowns that left both of them exhausted. But Maria had learned patience through her own struggles as a single mother, and something about Alexander's pain resonated with her own experiences of feeling abandoned and overlooked. Instead of matching his anger with authority, she met his outbursts with calm presence and gentle boundaries. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when Alexander, in the middle of a particularly violent tantrum over being asked to clean up his toys, suddenly collapsed onto the floor and began to cry with the raw, heartbroken sobs of a much younger child. Maria didn't try to stop him or rush to comfort him immediately. Instead, she sat down on the floor nearby and waited, her presence steady and undemanding. When his tears finally subsided, Alexander looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes and whispered, "Why don't my parents want to be with me?" The question broke Maria's heart, but she answered with the same honesty she used with Sofia when life presented difficult truths. "I think your parents love you very much, but sometimes grown-ups get so busy with work and worry that they forget how to show love in ways that feel good to kids. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. You're a wonderful, smart, funny boy who deserves to feel loved and seen." From that day forward, their relationship began to shift. Alexander still had difficult moments, but they became less frequent and less intense as he began to trust that Maria wouldn't abandon him when things got hard. She established routines that gave him predictability and security, helped him with homework in ways that celebrated his intelligence rather than highlighting his struggles, and most importantly, she listened to him with the same attention she gave to Sofia when her daughter needed to talk through her day. As weeks turned into months, Maria found herself genuinely caring for Alexander in ways that went beyond professional obligation. She saw glimpses of the sensitive, creative child beneath his defensive armor, the boy who drew elaborate pictures of fantastical worlds and asked profound questions about fairness and friendship. She also began to understand the loneliness that drove his challenging behaviors. His parents' work schedules kept them away from home most evenings and weekends, and when they were present, they seemed more focused on managing his behavior than connecting with him as a person. The contrast between Alexander's home life and the warm, chaotic love of Maria's small apartment became starkly apparent when circumstances forced her to bring Alexander home with her one evening. Victoria had called at the last minute to say she'd be several hours late, and Maria's own babysitter for Sofia had canceled, leaving her with no choice but to bring both children to her apartment. She'd expected Alexander to be uncomfortable in their modest surroundings, but instead, he seemed fascinated by the easy affection between Maria and Sofia. The way they cooked dinner together while Sofia chattered about her day and Maria listened with genuine interest. "Is this what normal families do?" Alexander asked quietly as they sat around Maria's small kitchen table, eating homemade enchiladas and sharing stories from their day. Sofia had immediately accepted Alexander's presence with the easy adaptability of childhood, showing him her favorite books and teaching him a clapping game she'd learned at school. Maria watched them interact and felt a pang of sadness for all the simple, loving moments Alexander had missed in his young life. Over the following months, Alexander began to flourish under Maria's consistent care and attention. His grades improved as she helped him develop study habits and celebrated his achievements, no matter how small. His tantrums became rare occurrences rather than daily battles, replaced by a growing ability to express his feelings with words rather than destructive actions. Most remarkably, he began to show the natural warmth and humor that had been buried beneath years of defensive behavior. Victoria and Robert noticed the changes in their son, but seemed puzzled by the transformation rather than curious about what had caused it. They expressed their appreciation for Maria's work in the form of bonus payments and glowing references to their friends. But they never asked about her methods or showed interest in learning how to replicate her success with Alexander during their limited time together. Maria found this heartbreaking but unsurprising, recognizing in the Hartwells the same emotional distance she'd seen in other wealthy families who hired others to provide the nurturing they couldn't or wouldn't give their children themselves. As Alexander's 9th and then 10th birthday approached, Maria realized she'd become more than his babysitter. She was his primary source of emotional support, the person he turned to when he needed comfort or guidance, the adult who celebrated his victories and helped him navigate his disappointments. The depth of their bond sometimes worried her, knowing that her employment with the Hartwells was ultimately temporary and that Alexander would eventually outgrow his need for a babysitter. She tried to prepare him for this inevitability while also cherishing the time they had together. The end came more abruptly than Maria had expected. When Alexander turned 11, Victoria announced that they felt he was mature enough to manage on his own after school and that they would no longer need Maria's services. The decision was presented as a natural progression rather than a termination, with generous severance pay and effusive praise for Maria's contribution to Alexander's development. But Maria could see the panic in Alexander's eyes when his mother delivered the news, the old fear of abandonment resurging despite years of progress. "This doesn't mean I disappear from your life completely," Maria told Alexander during their last official afternoon together, though she wasn't entirely sure how she would maintain their connection without the structure of San. Employment. "You'll always be special to me, and I'll always care about what happens to you. Sometimes relationships change form, but the love doesn't go away." Alexander clung to her with desperate intensity that final day, and Maria had to blink back tears as she promised to find ways to stay in touch. She left the Hartwell estate with a heavy heart, knowing she was leaving behind a child who still needed her nurturing presence, but was being deemed old enough to manage without it. The generous final payment would help her and Sofia through several months while she searched for new work, but no amount of money could ease the sense of loss she felt at being separated from Alexander. Life moved forward, as it always does, carrying them all into new chapters and challenges. Maria found work cleaning offices at night, a job that allowed her to be home when Sofia got out of school but left her exhausted most days. Sofia, now in middle school, had grown into a bright, compassionate girl who inherited her mother's warmth and resilience, along with her own fierce intelligence and artistic talent. Maria often marveled at how her daughter had thrived despite their financial struggles. developing into a young woman who saw beauty in small things and treated everyone with kindness, regardless of their circumstances. Years passed, and Maria occasionally wondered about Alexander, hoping he had continued to grow into the thoughtful, caring young man she'd glimpsed during their time together. She'd moved twice since leaving the Hartwells' employment, following better job opportunities and more affordable rent, so she had no way of knowing if Alexander ever tried to contact her. Sometimes she imagined him as a teenager, navigating high school and college with the emotional tools she'd tried to give him, but mostly she focused on her own life and Sofia's flourishing future. Sofia graduated high school with honors and earned a scholarship to study art therapy at the local university, a field that perfectly combined her artistic talents with her natural empathy for others. At 19, she was a stunning young woman with her mother's warm eyes and a confidence that Maria envied, the kind of self-assurance that comes from growing up loved and valued despite external circumstances. Sofia lived at home to save money and help with expenses, working part-time at a coffee shop near campus while maintaining excellent grades and volunteering at a children's hospital. It was at the coffee shop where Sofia first met Alexander again, though neither of them recognized each other immediately. He was 23 now, tall and broad-shouldered with the same intelligent green eyes but carrying himself with a confidence that hadn't existed when he was a lonely, angry child. He'd graduated from an elite business school and was working in his family's hotel company, but he'd grown tired of the sterile corporate environment and had started spending his free time in coffee shops and bookstores, places where real people lived real lives away from the artificial politeness of his parents' world. Alexander noticed Sofia immediately, drawn to her genuine smile and the way she remembered every customer's name and order, creating moments of warmth and connection in what could have been impersonal transactions. He began visiting the coffee shop daily, initially telling himself he was just enjoying the excellent coffee and peaceful atmosphere, but increasingly aware that he was hoping for moments of conversation with the beautiful barista who treated everyone with equal kindness. Their first real conversation happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Alexander was working on his laptop and Sofia was studying for an exam during her break. She'd noticed him there every day for weeks, always alone but never seeming lonely, focused on his work but always polite when he ordered. Something about his solitary presence reminded her of herself during high school, when she'd often felt like an outsider looking in at other people's lives. "Art therapy," Alexander said, reading the title of Sofia's textbook as she sat at a nearby table. "That sounds fascinating. What made you choose that field?" His voice was warm and genuinely curious, and Sofia found herself explaining her desire to use creativity to help people heal from trauma and express emotions they couldn't put into words. As she talked, Alexander listened with an intensity that made her feel heard and valued, asking thoughtful questions that showed he understood the deeper meaning behind her career choice. Their daily conversations gradually evolved into longer talks about art, psychology, family, and dreams for the future. Alexander found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he'd never expressed to anyone, drawn to Sofia's ability to listen without judgment and offer insights that seemed wise beyond her years. Sofia, in turn, was intrigued by this quietly thoughtful man who seemed to carry hidden depths and a sadness he couldn't quite articulate. When Alexander finally asked Sofia out to dinner, she said yes without hesitation, though she insisted on a casual place where they could talk without the pressure of formal dining. He took her to a small Italian restaurant in her neighborhood, and they spent 3 hours talking about everything and nothing, discovering shared interests in books and music, debating social issues with passionate but respectful disagreement, and laughing at each other's stories with the easy comfort of old friends. As their relationship deepened over the following months, both Alexander and Sofia felt they'd found something rare and precious in each other. Alexander had never experienced the kind of unconditional acceptance Sofia offered, love that didn't depend on his achievements or behavior, but simply celebrated who he was as a person. Sofia, who had watched her mother struggle with loneliness for years, was amazed to find someone who valued her thoughts and dreams while also making her feel cherished and protected. It was during one of their long evening walks that Alexander first mentioned being raised primarily by a babysitter who had changed his life through her kindness and patience. He spoke about Maria with deep affection and gratitude, describing how she'd seen past his anger to the hurt child beneath and taught him that he was worthy of love and attention. Sofia listened with growing recognition, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place as Alexander described the woman who had been like a mother to him during the most crucial years of his childhood. What was her name? Sofia asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer. Maria Santos, Alexander replied, his voice soft with memory. She was the first person who ever made me feel like I mattered, like I was worth the effort it took to understand me. I've tried to find her over the years, but my parents didn't keep her contact information, and I was just a kid when she worked for us. I don't even know if she's still in the city. Sofia stopped walking, her heart pounding as she turned to face Alexander with wonder and disbelief. Alexander, she whispered, studying his face with new eyes and seeing traces of the lonely boy her mother had described so many times over the years. Alexander Hartwell, you're the little boy my mother used to take care of. You're the child she still talks about, wondering how you turned out. The recognition hit Alexander like a lightning bolt. Years of wondering and searching suddenly resolved in the most unexpected way possible. The woman he'd fallen in love with was the daughter of the person who had saved him from his own anger and pain, who had shown him what unconditional love looked like when he desperately needed that lesson. The symmetry of it seemed too perfect to be coincidence, like the universe had conspired to bring them together across time and circumstances. Their reunion with Maria was emotional and overwhelming, filled with tears of joy and amazement at the strange workings of fate. Maria, now 47 and showing the effects of years of hard work and worry, was stunned to see how Alexander had grown into exactly the kind of man she'd hoped he would become. He was successful but not arrogant, confident but still capable of deep feeling, and clearly devoted to Sofia in ways that made Maria's heart sing with happiness for her daughter. Alexander's gratitude toward Maria was profound and almost overwhelming in its intensity. He credited her with teaching him emotional regulation, empathy, and the value of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. He told her that every good thing in his life could be traced back to the foundation she'd built during those crucial years when he'd been lost and angry and desperately in need of someone to believe in him. As Alexander and Sofia's relationship continued to deepen, he became a regular presence in their small apartment, sharing meals and conversations with the same natural ease he'd experienced as a child. Maria watched him interact with Sofia and marveled at how well-matched they were, how they brought out the best in each other while maintaining their individual strengths and interests. Alexander's success had given him financial security, but his relationship with Sofia and renewed connection with Maria provided him with the emotional grounding he'd been seeking his entire adult life. When Alexander proposed to Sofia on the anniversary of their first meeting at the coffee shop, he asked Maria for her blessing first, acknowledging her role as Sofia's primary parent and the person whose opinion mattered most to both of them. The proposal itself was simple but perfect, a quiet moment in their favorite park where he told Sofia that she had completed a circle in his life he hadn't even known was broken. Their engagement was a time of pure happiness for all three of them, filled with wedding planning and discussions of the future that felt bright with possibility. Alexander insisted on paying for the wedding, seeing it as his chance to give Maria the kind of celebration she'd never been able to afford, but deserved to share with her daughter. He also quietly took care of several of Maria's long-standing debts and arranged for her to transition from her exhausting night cleaning job to a position managing the housekeeping staff at one of his family's hotels. Work that offered better pay, benefits, and daytime hours. The wedding was everything Sofia had dreamed of, and more, held in the garden of one of the Hartwell hotels with friends and family gathered to celebrate a love story that seemed destined from the beginning. Victoria and Robert Hartwell attended, still somewhat bewildered by their son's choice to marry the daughter of his former babysitter, but gracious enough to welcome Sofia into the family with genuine warmth. Maria, radiant in a dress Alexander had insisted on buying for her, walked Sofia down the aisle with tears of joy streaming down her face. The first years of Alexander and Sofia's marriage were filled with the kind of happiness that seemed almost too good to be true. They bought a house in a neighborhood that struck a balance between Alexander's financial means and Sofia's desire to remain connected to her roots. Close enough to Maria's apartment that they could see her regularly, but far enough from the Hartwell estate that they could build their own life together. Sofia completed her degree and began working as an art therapist at the same children's hospital where she'd volunteered, finding deep satisfaction in helping young patients express their fears and hopes through creative expression. Alexander, inspired by Sofia's commitment to meaningful work, gradually shifted his focus within the family business toward hospitality programs that served underprivileged communities, creating scholarship funds and job training programs that gave people like Maria opportunities for advancement. He and Sofia talked often about starting a family of their own, both excited by the prospect of raising children with the kind of love and attention they'd each received from Maria in different ways. It was during one of their regular Sunday dinners at Maria's apartment that they first noticed something was wrong. Maria, usually energetic and talkative, seemed unusually tired and had barely touched her food. When Sofia asked if she was feeling well, Maria brushed off their concerns with a smile, claiming she was just working too hard and needed to get more sleep. But over the following weeks, her fatigue worsened, accompanied by a persistent cough and occasional dizziness that she continued to minimize. Sofia and Alexander grew increasingly worried as Maria's symptoms persisted and worsened despite her attempts to hide them. When she finally collapsed at work one afternoon, Alexander rushed to the hospital where she'd been taken by ambulance, his heart pounding with fear as he thought about losing the woman who had been more of a mother to him than his own biological parent. Sofia was already there, having been called from the children's hospital where she worked, and together they waited anxiously for news about Maria's condition. The diagnosis, when it came, was devastating in its stark simplicity. Maria had advanced lung cancer, likely caused by years of exposure to cleaning chemicals in poorly ventilated buildings, and the disease had already spread to her lymph nodes and liver. The oncologist, a kind but straightforward man, explained that treatment options were limited and expensive, and that without immediate and aggressive intervention, Maria had perhaps 6 months to live. The financial implications of Maria's treatment hit Sofia like a second blow. Even with the insurance from her hotel job, the cost of the experimental treatments and specialized care Maria would need far exceeded what they could afford. Sofia began researching second mortgages and personal loans, determined to find a way to pay for her mother's care, even if it meant bankruptcy. She'd been prepared to lose her house, her savings, everything she had, when Alexander quietly took control of the situation with a decisiveness that reminded her of the determined child he'd once been. "Money is not going to be an issue," Alexander told the oncologist during their next meeting, his voice calm but filled with steel. "Whatever Maria needs, wherever she needs to go, whatever specialists need to be consulted, the cost is irrelevant. I want her to have access to the best possible care, and I want it to start immediately." Alexander's wealth, which had always seemed almost abstract to Sofia, suddenly became a concrete blessing that could mean the difference between life and death for her mother. He arranged for Maria to be transferred to a world-renowned cancer center in another state, where a team of specialists would coordinate her treatment using the most advanced therapies available. He hired a private jet to transport her comfortably and arranged for Sofia to take a leave of absence from work so she could be with her mother throughout the treatment process. The cancer center was unlike any medical facility Maria had ever seen, with amenities that felt more like a luxury hotel than a hospital and staff who treated each patient like family rather than a medical case. Alexander had specifically chosen this facility not just for its medical reputation, but for its philosophy of treating the whole person rather than just the disease, providing emotional and spiritual support, alongside cutting-edge medical care. As Maria began her treatment regimen, Alexander visited as often as his work schedule allowed, always bringing flowers, books, or small gifts that showed he'd been thinking about her comfort and happiness. During one particularly difficult week when the chemotherapy had left Maria weak and discouraged, Alexander sat beside her bed and took her hand in his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You saved my life when I was 8 years old," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You saw me when no one else did, when I was angry and hurt and convinced I was unlovable. You taught me that I was worth caring about, that I deserved kindness and patience and understanding. Everything good in my life, including Sofia, can be traced back to what you gave me during those years. Now it's my turn to see you, to make sure you get every chance possible to stay with us." Maria's treatment was grueling, involving months of chemotherapy, radiation, and experimental drug therapies that left her weak and nauseated, but gradually began to shrink the tumors that threatened her life. Sofia rarely left her mother's side, sleeping in the hospital room and advocating fiercely for her care, while Alexander managed the logistics and expenses that made her treatment possible. The three of them formed an even stronger bond during those difficult months, united by their shared determination to fight the disease and their deep love for each other. The turning point came 6 months into treatment, when scans showed that Maria's tumors had shrunk significantly and that the cancer had stopped spreading. The oncology team was cautiously optimistic, noting that Maria's response to treatment had exceeded their initial expectations and that she might be a candidate for additional therapies that could extend her life significantly. Alexander celebrated this news by arranging for Maria's hospital room to be filled with flowers from the garden where he and Sofia had been married, a reminder of happier times and a promise of celebrations to come. As Maria's health slowly improved, she began to understand the full extent of what Alexander had done for her. The cancer center's social worker had quietly informed her that her treatment costs had exceeded $500,000, all paid without hesitation by the man who had once been a troubled child in her care. The magnitude of his generosity was overwhelming, but more than the money, Maria was moved by the love and devotion he'd shown throughout her illness. "I keep trying to thank you," Maria told Alexander during one of his visits, when she was finally strong enough to sit up and have longer conversations. "But I don't think there are words for what you've done for me, for us." Alexander shook his head, his expression serious but peaceful. "You don't need to thank me, Maria. You gave me a childhood when mine was falling apart. You taught me how to love and be loved. You raised the woman who became my wife and the greatest joy of my life. Everything I've been able to give you is just interest on a debt I can never fully repay." Maria's recovery was slow but steady, and after nearly a year of treatment, she was declared to be in remission. The cancer wasn't gone entirely, and she would need regular monitoring and maintenance treatments for the rest of her life, but her prognosis had improved dramatically from the 6 months she'd originally been given. Alexander arranged for her to receive ongoing care from a team of specialists in their home city, ensuring that distance would never again be a barrier to her receiving the best possible medical attention. The day Maria was finally discharged from the cancer center was one of joyous celebration for all three of them. Alexander had arranged for the same private jet that had brought her to treatment to take them home, and Sofia had decorated their house with welcome banners and flowers. As they sat together in Maria's living room that evening, surrounded by the simple possessions she'd thought she might never see again, Maria reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them all to this moment. "You know," Maria said, looking at Alexander and Sofia curled together on her couch, "when I first took that job babysitting you, I thought I was just trying to pay my bills and take care of Sofia. I never imagined I was investing in our future, that the little boy I was trying to help would grow up to save all our lives." Alexander squeezed Sofia's hand and smiled at Maria with the same warmth she remembered from his childhood, when glimpses of his true nature had shone through the anger and hurt. "I think maybe we saved each other," he said. "You taught me that love doesn't have conditions or expiration dates. You showed me that someone could see the worst parts of me, and still believe I was worth the effort. That lesson changed everything about how I saw myself and what I thought I deserved from life." In the months that followed Maria's return home, their family settled into a new rhythm that accounted for her ongoing medical needs while celebrating her renewed health and energy. Alexander continued to manage her care with the same attention to detail he brought to his business ventures. But Maria had regained enough independence to return to work part-time and to resume many of the activities she'd enjoyed before her diagnosis. Sofia, who had taken extended leave to care for her mother, gradually returned to her work as an art therapist, finding that her experience with her mother's illness had deepened her empathy and effectiveness with her younger patients. The experience of nearly losing Maria had intensified everyone's appreciation for the time they had together and their commitment to making the most of every moment. Alexander and Sofia began seriously discussing starting a family, knowing that Maria's presence in their children's lives would be one of the greatest gifts they could offer the next generation. They bought a larger house with a guest suite designed specifically for Maria, ensuring that she would always have a place in their growing family while maintaining her independence and dignity. Alexander's relationship with his own parents had evolved significantly during Maria's illness. Victoria and Robert Hartwell had been shocked by their son's devotion to his former babysitter and the enormous financial resources he'd committed to her care. Initially, they'd questioned his priorities and suggested that his emotional investment in Maria's family was inappropriate given their different social standings. But as they witnessed the depth of love and loyalty that connected Alexander, Sofia, and Maria, they began to understand what they had missed during their own son's childhood. The Hartwells made tentative efforts to build a closer relationship with Alexander, recognizing perhaps for the first time that their focus on providing material advantages had left them disconnected from their son's crash. Emotional life. Alexander was cautious, but open to their overtures, particularly after Sofia encouraged him to consider the possibility that people could grow and change even late in life. The relationship remained somewhat formal and distant, but it was built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than the resentment and disappointment that had characterized Alexander's childhood. As Maria's health stabilized and their family dynamic found its new equilibrium, Alexander often reflected on the unlikely series of events that had brought them all together. The lonely, angry child who had thrown toys and refused to be comforted had grown into a man capable of profound love and generosity. The struggling single mother who had taken a babysitting job out of desperate financial need had received care and support beyond anything she could have imagined. The young woman who had grown up watching her mother sacrifice for others had found the partner who valued both her independence and his commitment to her family. On quiet evenings when they gathered for dinner at Maria's apartment or in Alexander and Sofia's garden, the conversation often turned to memories of those early years when none of them could have predicted how their lives would intertwine. Alexander would tease Sofia about inheriting her mother's stubborn determination to help others, while Maria would remind them both that love planted in childhood often takes years to fully bloom but can sustain families through any challenge. The story of their interconnected lives became something of a legend in their community, shared as an example of how kindness and patience can create bonds that transcend social boundaries and economic differences. Maria's recovery inspired other families facing similar medical crises, and Alexander quietly established a foundation that helped provide advanced cancer treatment for patients who couldn't afford it themselves. Sofia incorporated their story into her work with children, helping young patients understand that difficult circumstances don't have to define their futures, and that the love they receive during their darkest moments to become the foundation for lives filled with purpose and joy. Years later, when Alexander and Sofia's first child was born, a daughter they named Isabella after Maria's mother, Maria held her granddaughter with tears of gratitude streaming down her face. The baby who slept peacefully in her arms represented not just the continuation of their family line, but the fulfillment of a circle that had begun 20 years earlier when a desperate single mother had answered an ad for a babysitting job. Isabella would grow up surrounded by the love of parents who had found each other through extraordinary circumstances, and a grandmother whose life had been saved by the very child she had once nurtured through his darkest hours. As Maria rocked her granddaughter in the same apartment where she had once calculated bills and worried about the future, she marveled at the mysterious ways life had of rewarding kindness with unexpected blessings. The little boy who had once thrown puzzles across the room in frustrated rage had become the man who ensured she would live to see her daughter marry and her grandchildren grow. The desperate financial struggles that had driven her to take any job available had led her to the work that would ultimately save not just one life, but 3. Creating a family bound not just by love, but by the shared understanding that they had all been gifts to each other when they needed saving most. The coffee shop where Alexander and Sofia had first reconnected became a place of pilgrimage for their family, a location they visited on anniversaries and special occasions to remember how fate had worked its magic in the most ordinary of settings. The owner, who had witnessed their courtship from behind the counter, kept a photo of their wedding day on the wall, telling customers the story of how love had found a way across years and circumstances to bring two hearts together. Alexander's business success continued to grow, but he measured his achievements differently now, focusing on projects that created opportunities for others rather than simply generating profit. He established mentorship programs for children from single-parent families, understanding from his own experience how crucial it was for young people to have adults who believed in their potential. Sofia's work as an art therapist flourished as well, and she often invited Maria to visit the children's hospital, where patients were inspired by meeting a grandmother who had survived cancer and whose story proved that hope could triumph over even the darkest diagnoses. The foundation Alexander created in Maria's honor grew into a significant force for good, providing not just financial assistance for cancer treatment, but comprehensive support for families navigating serious illness. The foundation's philosophy, shaped by their own experience, recognized that healing required more than medical intervention, that families needed practical help, emotional support, and the knowledge that they weren't facing their challenges alone. Maria served on the foundation's board, bringing her perspective as someone who had been on the receiving end of such generosity and ensuring that the programs they funded truly met the needs of the people they served. As Isabella grew from infant to toddler, she became the center of a universe filled with love and attention from three adults who understood the preciousness of family bonds. Alexander proved to be a devoted father who had learned from Maria's example how to balance structure with warmth, setting boundaries while always making his daughter feel valued and heard. Sofia brought her artistic nature and therapeutic training to motherhood, encouraging Isabella's creativity while helping her develop emotional intelligence and empathy for others. Maria, whose own experience as a young single mother had been marked by worry and struggle, reveled in her role as grandmother, able to enjoy Isabella's childhood without the financial stress that had overshadowed Sofia's early years. The little girl grew up hearing stories about how her parents had found each other and how her grandmother had been the angel who saved both their lives in different ways. Isabella learned that families could be created through love and choice as much as through blood, that the bonds between people were strengthened through shared challenges and mutual care. She absorbed these lessons naturally, developing into a child who treated everyone with kindness and who understood instinctively that she was part of something larger than herself. On Isabella's third birthday, Alexander surprised Maria with a gift that left her speechless with emotion. He had commissioned an artist to create a detailed painting of the three generations of their family, but instead of a traditional portrait, the artwork depicted key moments from their intertwined story. Maria was shown comforting a young Alexander during one of his difficult moments. Sofia was portrayed working with children at the hospital. Alexander appeared supporting Maria during her cancer treatment, and all three were shown together celebrating Isabella's birth. The painting captured not just their faces, but the love that connected them across time and circumstance. "This is our family's story," Alexander explained as Maria stared at the painting through tears. "But it's also a reminder that every child who feels unloved, every parent who struggles to provide, every person who faces illness or hardship, has the potential for this kind of transformation. What you gave me wasn't just care and attention. You gave me the belief that I was worthy of love, and that belief became the foundation for everything beautiful that followed." The painting hung in the place of honor in Maria's living room, where visitors could see the visual representation of how love multiplied across generations, how kindness planted in one season could bloom into miracles years later. Children who came to play with Isabella would ask about the pictures, and Maria would tell them simplified versions of the story, always emphasizing that every person had the power to change someone else's life through simple acts of compassion and understanding. As Isabella prepared for her fourth birthday, Sofia and Alexander shared the news that they were expecting their second child. The pregnancy had come as a wonderful surprise, and Maria's joy was so profound that she laughed and cried simultaneously when they told her. This child, a son they would name Gabriel, would grow up in a world where his grandmother's health was stable, where his parents' love story was already legend, where the foundation of security and affection had been firmly established through years of shared triumph over adversity. Gabriel's birth was celebrated with the same gratitude and wonder that had marked Isabella's arrival, but with an added sense of completion, as if this child represented the final piece of a puzzle that had been decades in the making. Alexander held his son for the first time with hands that trembled with emotion, remembering the angry, frightened boy he had once been, and marveling at the journey that had brought him to this moment of perfect peace and joy. Maria, now in her 50s and 5 years cancer-free, had become something of a local celebrity through her work with the foundation and her appearances in hospital events, where she shared her story with other families facing similar challenges. Her message was always the same, that love was the most powerful medicine, that hope could survive even in the darkest circumstances, and that the people who entered our lives as temporary helpers often became permanent blessings in ways we could never predict. The children grew up immersed in this legacy of love and service, learning from their earliest years that they were part of a family dedicated to helping others, and that their own privileges came with responsibilities to share their good das. Fortune. Isabella, now 5 and keenly intelligent, had already begun asking if she could visit the hospital with her mother to help the sick children with their art projects. Gabriel, though still a toddler, showed signs of inheriting his grandfather's thoughtful nature and his mother's empathetic instincts. Alexander's relationship with his own parents had continued to evolve. Particularly after Isabella and Gabriel were born, and Victoria and Robert became grandparents, determined not to repeat the emotional distance that had characterized their relationship with their son. They made genuine efforts to be present and engaged with their grandchildren, and while their interactions remained somewhat formal compared to the easy warmth of Maria's relationships with the children, they were building new patterns of connection based on the recognition that family bonds required intentional nurturing. The Hartwell family business had been transformed under Alexander's leadership, becoming known not just for luxury accommodations but for ethical business practices and community involvement. Alexander had implemented programs that provided career advancement opportunities for employees, college scholarships for their children, and healthcare benefits that extended to part-time workers. The company's mission statement, written by Alexander himself, declared that true hospitality meant caring for people not just as customers but as human beings deserving of dignity and opportunity. Sofia's career had also flourished as she became recognized as a leader in the field of pediatric art therapy. She had published research on the healing power of creative expression and had been invited to speak at conferences around the country about innovative approaches to helping children process trauma and illness. Her work was deeply informed by her own family's experience of facing serious health challenges and finding strength through love and creative expression. The foundation that bore Maria's name had grown into a major force in the fight against cancer, funding research, providing treatment assistance, and supporting families through comprehensive care programs. Maria remained actively involved in the foundation's work, but she had also returned to more personal pursuits, taking art classes with Sofia and learning to paint watercolor landscapes that captured the beauty she saw in everyday moments with her family. On quiet Sunday afternoons, when the extended family gathered for dinner and conversation, Alexander often found himself reflecting on the miraculous chain of events that had brought them all together. The desperate single mother who had needed work, the lonely child who had needed love, the young woman who had needed partnership, and the grandmother who had needed salvation, had all found exactly what they required in each other, at precisely the moments when those gifts were most needed. Their story had become more than just a family history. It had become a testament to the power of human connection to transform lives and circumstances in ways that seemed impossible until they happened. Alexander and Sofia often talked about writing a book about their experiences, not to gain fame or attention, but to offer hope to other families facing challenges that seemed insurmountable. They wanted other people to know that love planted in one generation could bloom into miracles for the next, that kindness given freely could return multiplied beyond imagination. As Isabella and Gabriel grew older and began to understand more fully the significance of their family's journey, they absorbed the lessons their parents and grandmother had learned through years of struggle and triumph. They learned that every person they met had the potential to change their lives in profound ways, that circumstances could shift dramatically through love and determination, and that the greatest privilege was the opportunity to help others find their own paths to healing and hope. The little apartment where Maria had once sat calculating bills and worrying about the future had been kept as a sort of family shrine, a place where they could remember how far they had traveled together and appreciate the humble beginnings that had led to such extraordinary blessings. Isabella and Gabriel loved to play in the rooms where their mother had grown up and their grandmother had raised her daughter with such devotion and sacrifice. Maria's health remained stable as she entered her 6th year of remission, and her medical team was cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. The experimental treatments that Alexander had made possible had given her not just extra years, but quality years filled with energy and purpose. She had become a mentor to newly diagnosed patients, offering them the hope that came from her own successful battle and the assurance that they weren't fighting alone. The story of Maria, Alexander, Sofia, Isabella, and Gabriel, had become interwoven with the stories of countless other families who had been touched by their foundation's work, their example of love overcoming gasho, obstacles, and their commitment to lifting others as they climbed. Their family dinners often included guests who had become part of their extended chosen family, people whose lives had intersected with theirs through the foundation's work or through the natural connections that formed when people dedicated their lives to service. Alexander's transformation from angry, lonely child to devoted husband, father, and philanthropist was complete, but it was also ongoing. A daily choice to live from the lessons Maria had taught him about love, patience, and the fundamental worth of every human being. Sofia's growth from the daughter of a struggling single mother to accomplished professional and mother was similarly ongoing, a continuous expression of the values her mother had instilled through example and sacrifice. The cancer center, where Maria had received her life-saving treatment, had established a wing in her honor. Funded by Alexander's donations and designed according to Sofia's artistic vision to create spaces that promoted healing through beauty and comfort. The wing featured art therapy rooms where patients could express their fears and hopes through creative work, family rooms where loved ones could rest and find support, and garden spaces where people could connect with nature and find peace during their most difficult moments. On the 10th anniversary of Maria's diagnosis, the family gathered to celebrate not just her survival, but the extraordinary life that had grown from the foundation of love and sacrifice she had established decades earlier. The celebration was held in the garden of the Cancer Center, surrounded by flowers and art created by patients who had found healing through the programs Sofia had helped design. Isabella and Gabriel, now old enough to understand the full significance of the occasion, presented their grandmother with a book they had created together, filled with drawings and stories about the family's journey and their hopes keys for the future. As Maria looked around at the faces of the people who had become her chosen family, she was struck by the realization that every difficult moment, every sacrifice, every worry-filled night of her early years as a single mother had led to this moment of perfect gratitude and joy. The angry little boy she had once tried to comfort had become the man who saved her life. The daughter she had raised with such love and determination had become a healer who helped children find their own strength. The grandchildren she had feared she might never meet had become the lights of her world, carrying forward the legacy of love and service that defined their family. The final chapter of their story was still being written, but it was already clear that the love planted in a modest apartment by a struggling single mother and nurtured in the playroom of a lonely child had grown into something that would continue to bless and transform lives for generations to come. Their family had become living proof that no act of kindness was ever wasted, that love given freely always returned multiplied, and that the most extraordinary miracles often grew from the most ordinary moments of human connection and care. The coffee shop where it all began still served Alexander's favorite coffee, and Sofia still remembered the orders of regular customers. But now their visits there were celebrations of the love story that had started at a small table by the window where two hearts had recognized each other across the years and circumstances that had shaped their separate journeys toward this shared destiny. Their story had become a legend of hope that would be told for years to come, a reminder that every ending was also a beginning, and that love, once given, became eternal.